start the 17th chapter of Exodus today. We saw before that God had repeatedly promised the children of Israel to be their God. He had promised to take them to himself as his special people and to lead them to that promised land. But they were ever ready to complain and to murmur at every obstacle in the way to that promised land. They forgot all of the hardships of their captivity in Egypt. And they, like many of us today, saw and felt only their present inconveniences and concerns. When our faith is tested, even by little trials, we find that we tend to manifest no more faith or patience than did ancient Israel. We saw last week, for example, that in every week of their 40 years wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites witnessed a threefold miracle. A miracle that had been designed to impress their minds with the sacredness of God's holy Sabbath. Those threefold miracles were, first of all, a double quantity of manna fell every sixth day. Second, we saw that no manna was there on the seventh day. And third, we also saw that the portion needed for the Sabbath, which was gathered on Friday, was preserved, whereas if any were kept over at any other time, it would become full of worms and stink. We saw that in the circumstances connected with the giving of manna, that there is conclusive evidence that the Sabbath was not instituted, as many claim today, when the law was given at Sinai, because this was 2 weeks before they ever got to Sinai. For 40 years, they were daily reminded by this miraculous provision of God's unfailing care and tender love. And then we concluded and saw where Jesus made application of that to himself when he said in the Gospel of John, "I am that bread of life. Your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which cometh from heaven. If any man eat this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world." Now, as we begin our study today, we see that after leaving the wilderness of sin, that the Israelites encamped in Rephidim, and again there was no water, and so again they began to distrust God and began to murmur. Chapter 17 and verse 1. "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of sin after their journeys, according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord?" Is this the first time that they'd gone somewhere and didn't find water? No. Every time God had made provisions. And here again, instead of turning to the Lord, they began to complain. They began to argue with Moses now. And it says, "Wherefore the people did chide with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto him, Why do you chide with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord?" You see, when you begin to complain, we saw last week too, who do we complain against? God. And it upsets God greatly. "And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" They begin to wonder, In their blindness and presumption, the people come to Moses and they complain. Their demand is, give us water that we may drink. Moses says, why do you want to strive with me? Why do you tempt the Lord this way? And it says they then cried in anger. These people are very, very upset now. Why is it that you brought us out of Egypt? Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us, and to kill our children, and to kill our livestock by thirst. Remember, first time it was or the last time we were looking at it, it was because of hunger. Every time. When they had complained about hunger, God had provided manna. And they'd been so abundantly supplied with food. And they now, at that time, remembered in shame their murmurings. But now they forgot again. They failed at the first trial again. Are they a lot like we are today?
Yes.
God does it. We're happy. A little time goes by. Well, God, I need something else. And we get upset. You see, that pillar of cloud that had been leading them since they left now seemed to veil some fearful mystery within. And this Moses, well, who is he? And what could be his object in bringing us out of Egypt? Is it to kill us and take all of our possessions to himself? Suspicion and distrust filled their hearts, and they boldly accused him of designing to kill them and their children, to deprive them of things necessary for life so that he could enrich himself. And in the tumult of rage, the indignation became so great that, watch, they are ready to stone him. Verse 4, and Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, what shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, go on before the people, and take with you the elders of Israel, and your rod wherewith you smote the river. Take in thine hand and go. Behold, I will stand before you. There's a key phrase right there. Always allow the Lord to stand before you, and never seek to stand before the Lord. Keep him before you at all times. I'll be there with you, he says. I'll stand before you there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come out water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of all the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massa, temptation, and Meribah, or chiding, or strife, because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Doubted God. These places named after their doubt. Moses said, what am I going to do, Lord? They want to kill me now. He's told to go get the elders, go get before the people, take that staff, and smite that rock. And Moses did what God said, and out of a rock came forth water, a living stream, abundantly supplied water for the entire camp, for over 1 million people, water from a rock. And instead of commanding Moses to lift up his rod and call down some terrible plague, we see the mercy of God when the Lord in his mercy made the rod an instrument of providing for them. Moses smote the rock, but it was the Son of God who was veiled there in that cloudy pillar that stood beside Moses that actually gave the people water. Moses couldn't make water come out of a stone. No human being can. But God can do anything at any time. He says, I am God. Is there anything too hard for me? But not only Moses and the elders, but all of the congregation stood at a distance there and beheld the glory of God there. But had that cloudy pillar, that cloud that was there, been removed, every person there would have been slain. The cloud had to veil the glory and the majesty of the one who was veiled within that cloud. And in their midst, these people had the living God with them. But in their thirst, the people had tempted God and said, is the Lord among us? They saw it. They saw that cloud in the day and the fire at night. They'd seen all of these miraculous things back there in their past. If God has brought us here, why doesn't He give us something to drink? Why doesn't He give us water as well as manna? And the unbelief thus manifested, friends, was absolutely criminal. And Moses was fearful for the people that the judgments of God would rest upon them. And he called the name of the place Massa, temptation. And also gave it a second name, Meribah, because there they strove and they criticized and they condemned God. Those stood as memorials to their sin. But now a new danger threatens them. Because of their murmurings against Him, the Lord allowed them to be attacked by their enemies. The Amalekites, a fierce and warlike tribe inhabiting that area, came out against them and smote the weaker ones at the rear of the group of the encampment. Moses knew that the children of Israel were unprepared for battle. And so he told Joshua to choose from the different tribes some soldiers and lead these soldiers out against the Amalekites. And so pick it up here in verse 8. Then came Amalek and fought against Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, choose us out and go out and fight with Amalek tomorrow. I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him, and he fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. So we find something interesting. As Aaron and Hur went up on top of the hill, Moses stood there with his hands up in the air and holding that rod in his hand. And as long as his hands were up, it showed that the children of Israel were winning. These men on the top of the hill showed the people down below their duty to sustain him in his work, while he was to receive word from God to relay to them. The act of Moses also was significant in showing that God held everyone's destiny in His hands. As God moved there, the enemies either fell back or came forward. While the children of Israel made God their trust, He would fight for them and subdue their enemies. But when they should let go their hold upon Him who is all-powerful and trust in their own power, they would become even weaker than those who did not acknowledge God. And we see this happen repeatedly in their history. So as the Hebrews triumphed when Moses was reaching his hands toward heaven and interceding in their behalf, so the people of God today will prevail when they by faith take hold of the strength of their mighty helper. And yet divine strength is to be combined with that human effort. Moses did not believe that God would overcome their foes while the people just remained inactive. The people had to go out and meet the enemy. And while the great leader was pleading with the Lord, Joshua and his brave followers were putting forth their utmost effort down in the valley to repulse the enemies of Israel and of God. These Amalekites were some interesting people. The Amalekites were descendants of Esau's son, Amalek. So they were relatives. And throughout their history, the Amalekites, from this point in time when we're first introduced to them as a people rather than the descendants of Esau's son, from this point until their final destruction by Hezekiah, the Amalekites warred against the children of Israel. They were people who were not ignorant of God's character. They were not ignorant of God's sovereignty. But instead of fearing before Him, they had set themselves to defy the power of God. The wonders wrought by Moses before the Egyptians were made a subject of mockery by the people of Amalek. And the fears of surrounding nations were mocked by the Amalekites. They had taken an oath by their gods that they would destroy the Hebrews so that not one of them would escape. And they tried for centuries to do that. And they boasted that Israel's God would be powerless to resist them. You see, it's interesting to keep in mind that these people, the Amalekites, had not been threatened by the Israelites. The Israelites weren't bothering them. As a matter of fact, they were just passing along the very edge of the borders of the area that the Amalekites controlled. And their assault was wholly unprovoked. It was to manifest their hatred and defiance of God that the Amalekites sought to destroy the people of God. Notice what happens here now. As we read on, they went out and stood before them. And here, picking it up in verse 12 again, I want to read this. But Moses' hands were heavy. And so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And they went out at dawn, at daybreak, to do battle. Moses goes and stands like this, but after several hours, not only were Moses' arms getting tired, but his legs were getting tired. So they take a stone, whether they had Moses step over to where there was one or whether they carried one over and put it behind him, they got a stone big enough for Moses to sit on. And he's sitting there holding it up, but after a while, he couldn't do it. Moses sits there, and Aaron and Hur take one of each of his arms and support them for him. Friends, we can learn that we need to support our leaders. We need to lift their arms up. We need to hold them up before the Lord and not ridicule and seek to tear down and dissect every little thing they do. We need not to murmur and seek to destroy those that God has put in leadership positions. Because even if they're not doing their job, who put them in the position? And do you think that you know more than God? Do you not trust God to do what needs to be done among His body of people? Did He make some mistake somewhere that we need to correct for Him? Or do we trust God and believe that He is in charge? You know, the people could have said, don't put Aaron back in as the high priest, because we're going to see Aaron builds a golden calf. He was the high priest. He was the next man in control of the people. As a matter of fact, when he did that evil thing, he was the number one guy in charge over the people. Human beings make mistakes. Or maybe you don't. If you don't, come see me after the service. I sure would like to talk to you for a little while. Lift up the hands of the leader. And so they stand there and they hold up his hands until the sun goes down. And notice in 13, and Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. God did. It took a while. You see, there was that battle there. Then the Amalekites gave the Israelites some trouble under the period of the judges. Then Saul comes on the scene and he wiped out most of them. Left a few of them for David, and David got all of them except for a few tribes scattered out there in the wilderness. And then came King Hezekiah, and Hezekiah completely obliterated him from the planet. Just as God had said. This is the first curse pronounced against him by Moses. Balaam later pronounces one. And finally it was fulfilled. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi, which is the hand upon the throne of the Lord. For he said, because the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. The Amalekites had long been high-minded sinners. And their enemies had cried to God for vengeance. Yet God's mercy had been working with the Amalekites, trying to bring them back to repentance. They were, like I said, the cousins of the Israelites. But when the men of Amalek fell upon God's weary and defenseless people, they sealed their own doom. And even today, friends, the care of God is over the weakest of his children. He watches over you. He cares for you. He cares for this church. It is the one object of God's supreme regard. And weak and enfeebled as it is still God's chosen. And no act of cruelty or oppression toward the church or the individuals who make up that body is unnoted by God. He sees it all and he makes note of it. And over all who love and fear God, his hand extends as a shield. It says in Psalms 91, he is our shield and our buckler. And thus we need to all beware that we not smite that hand of God in oppressing any of the children of God, because that hand wields a sword of justice, and there will be a day of retribution. This is why Jesus says, love even your what? Enemies. By this shall men know that ye are my disciples, that ye have what? Love one for another. Don't hold hatred or animosity toward any of the children of God. From the weakest in the pews to the most perverse of leaders. God is in control, and God's hand is over each of us. And let God deal with these things. And take the counsel that Paul gives in Romans. Who art thou, O man, that judges another man's servant? We are the servants of God. And I commend each of you to that God until that day when, as the song said, we'll exchange it for a crown and share in his glory forever.